British cinema has never played it safe. It's not just tea-sipping detectives and polite period dramas. It's firestorms that shook audiences, angered politicians, and sometimes got banned outright. These films weren't just watched, they were fought over, censored, and whispered about in headlines. Why did they hit nerves so hard? And why do they still sting decades later? Stick around because we're digging up the films Britain tried to keep locked away. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. Few films in history caused the kind of cultural earthquake that A Clockwork Orange unleashed. Directed by Stanley Kubrick, adapted from Anthony Burgess's novel, it was a blistering vision of a future Britain drenched in brutality, control, and eerie charm. What made it so controversial? It didn't just show shocking acts, it forced you to look at them through the cold, grinning eyes of Alex DeLarge, played with chilling brilliance by Malcolm McDowell. When the film hit British cinemas, critics erupted. Some praised its genius, others called it dangerous. Politicians fumed, newspaper headlines screamed, and reports claimed the film inspired copycat crimes. The controversy grew so relentless that Kubrick himself demanded the film be withdrawn from release in the UK. Imagine that. One of the most famous directors in the world banning his own film in his home country. For nearly 30 years, British audiences couldn't officially see it in theaters. But here's the thing, ban something, and people only want it more. Bootleg copies circulated like forbidden treasures. When it finally returned in 2000, its impact hadn't dulled one bit. Viewers saw what the censors feared all along, a film that doesn't just entertain, but dares you to confront the darkest parts of society and yourself. So, was it dangerous, or just ahead of its time? Either way, A Clockwork Orange proved that sometimes the scariest thing isn't the violence on screen, it's the uncomfortable reflection staring back at you. Scum, 1979. If you think British television was all cozy dramas and family-friendly fun, Scum came to smash that illusion into pieces. Originally made in 1977 for the BBC, Alan Clarke's raw story of life inside a borstal, Britain's youth detention centers, was so explosive the BBC refused to air it. Clarke wouldn't back down, remaking it in 1979 as a feature film, and what hit the screen was as hard as a punch to the jaw. The film followed Ray Winstone as Carlin, a young offender who quickly learns that survival inside the borstal means brutal dominance or becoming a victim. Clarke didn't sugarcoat anything: the daily violence, the cruelty of guards, the lawless pecking order among inmates. It was a system laid bare, and what people saw shocked them. Critics were divided. Some hailed it as an essential wake-up call to the failures of the justice system. Others blasted it as exploitative. Politicians demanded bans, schools warned against it, and the word spread that this film was too much for the public. But audiences, they couldn't look away. It felt too real, too raw, like a documentary smuggled out of Britain's darkest corners. Today, Scum is remembered as one of the most uncompromising depictions of institutional cruelty ever filmed. It didn't just question authority, it made authority sweat. Clarke wasn't offering answers. He was holding up a mirror, and sometimes that's more dangerous than anything else. The Devils, 1971. Ken Russell never made films to play nice, but The Devils is the one that burned the loudest. Based on real 17th century events in France, it told the story of political corruption, hysteria, and abuse of power, shot with Russell's trademark mix of operatic intensity and surreal imagery. But when British audiences saw it, chaos followed. From its opening frames, the film dared to be confrontational. Towering sets designed by Derek Jarman, performances from Oliver Reed and Vanessa Redgrave that radiated intensity, and scenes that pushed boundaries further than most people thought possible in 1971. Reviewers didn't just argue about it, they screamed. Some declared it a masterpiece. Others wanted it buried. Censors hacked away at scenes. Entire countries banned it. And still the outrage poured in. What made it so dangerous wasn't just the shocking imagery, it was the way Russell exposed the ugly machinery of authority, stripping away the illusion of order and leaving only hypocrisy and madness. For some, it felt like blasphemy. For others, it was bold, fearless truth-telling. Even today, the film has never been fully released uncut in Britain. That's how radioactive it remains. But those who've seen it often describe it as one of the most powerful films of the century. Love it or loathe it, The Devil stands as proof that cinema can ignite fury like nothing else. And maybe that's why it still hasn't cooled down. Straw Dogs, 1971. Sam Peckinpah may have been American, but when he came to the quiet villages of Cornwall to shoot straw dogs, he left Britain with one of its most infamous films. Starring Dustin Hoffman as a timid mathematician and Susan George as his wife, the story followed a couple moving to rural England, only to find themselves in a slow spiral of menace and violence. The controversy? The film's harrowing depiction of escalating brutality in an isolated community. Critics were horrified, not only at the physical violence, but at how disturbingly real the tension felt. The peaceful countryside became a trap, every friendly smile hiding danger, every silence dripping with threat. When the violence finally erupted, audiences were shaken to their core, censors debated endlessly, and bans were slapped on the film in parts of Britain for decades. For many, Straw Dogs wasn't just controversial, it was toxic. Yet others argued it was Peckinpah's most honest work, forcing viewers to confront primal instincts and uncomfortable questions about masculinity, violence, and survival. The film still divides opinion. Some call it unforgivable, others call it brilliant, but no one calls it forgettable. Straw Dogs turned the sleepy fields of Cornwall into a nightmare landscape and left Britain wrestling with the fallout. Women in Love, 1969. Before Ken Russell made The Devils, he had already rattled Britain with Women in Love. Based on D.H. Lawrence's novel, it followed two sisters entangled in love, desire, and shifting social roles in post-World War I England. Sounds like standard literary drama, right? Wrong. Russell brought intensity, boldness, and a willingness to show what polite cinema usually hid away. What set off alarms was a scene between Oliver Reed and Alan Bates, an extended wrestling match by firelight that critics called daring, scandalous, and unforgettable. For audiences used to restraint, this was an earthquake. Suddenly, a British film was treating physical intimacy with raw honesty, not shy glances or polite fade-outs. Reviews were electric. Some praised it as revolutionary, others scolded it as indecent. Yet beneath the headline-grabbing moments, the film was deeply serious, wrestling with themes of repression, freedom, and the cost of love in a changing society. Glenda Jackson's performance earned her an Academy Award, cementing the film's legacy not just as a shocker, but as an artistic triumph. Women in Love forced British cinema to grow up. It challenged boundaries, enraged the cautious, and thrilled those who were ready for something braver. And in doing so, it lit the fuse for a wave of bold filmmaking that followed. Crash, 1996. When David Cronenberg brought Crash to British screens, it wasn't the applause of critics he got, it was outrage. Adapted from J.G. Ballard's equally divisive novel, the film dove headfirst into the obsession between machinery, danger, and human desire. On paper, it sounded like a strange art house experiment. On screen, it was a bomb that detonated across Britain's cultural landscape. The controversy was instant. Some hailed it as daring and visionary, while others called it repulsive. In London, several borough councils went as far as banning it outright, a rare move in the 1990s when censorship was supposedly loosening its grip. Politicians lined up to condemn it, newspapers published furious editorials, and television debates turned into shouting matches. For weeks, Crash wasn't just a film, it was a national scandal. But here's the thing. Strip away the outrage, and what you're left with is Cronenberg doing what he does best, pushing audiences into territory they'd rather avoid. The film asked uncomfortable questions about danger, obsession, and the ways people seek meaning through extremes. Was it shocking? Absolutely. But it wasn't shock for its own sake. Cronenberg wanted you squirming in your seat, wrestling with ideas long after the credits rolled. Even now, Crash stands as one of the most polarizing films ever released in Britain. Love it or loathe it, it demanded a reaction. And maybe that's why it remains legendary. Not because it was easy to watch, but because it refused to let you look away. Trainspotting, 1996. When Danny Boyle's Trainspotting burst onto screens, Britain didn't just get a film, it got a cultural event. This wasn't a neat anti-drug message with sad piano music in the background. This was raw, fast, ugly, funny, and horrifying, all rolled into one. Following a group of heroin users in Edinburgh, the film swung wildly between bleak realism and electrifying style. From the opening chase scored to Iggy Pop's Lust for Life, it was clear Boyle wasn't pulling punches. Ewan McGregor's Mark Renton narrates the chaos of addiction with a mix of charm and despair, making audiences laugh one minute and recoil the next. The film's infamous scenes, from the filthiest toilet in cinema history to surreal hallucinations, hit like gut punches. Critics and politicians pounced. Was Trainspotting glamorizing drug culture, or exposing its horrors with unflinching honesty? Tabloids warned it would corrupt youth, while fans argued it showed addiction more truthfully than any "Just Say No" campaign ever could. The debate raged, but one fact was undeniable. The film hit a nerve like nothing else in the 90s. And beyond the controversy, it struck gold as a piece of cinema. Its energy, its characters, its unforgettable soundtrack, all of it carved Trainspotting into the cultural fabric of Britain. It made international stars of its cast and gave British cinema a shot of adrenaline that hasn't worn off. Controversial? Absolutely. Iconic? Without question. If 1968, when Lindsay Anderson's If stormed Cannes and walked away with the Palme d'Or, Britain wasn't celebrating, it was fuming. The film, set in an elite boarding school, began like a quirky satire on tradition and authority. But by the end, it had morphed into a violent student uprising that left audiences stunned. Malcolm McDowell, in his first major role, led the charge as Mick Travis, a student pushed to breaking point by the cruelty and hypocrisy of the system. What began as cheeky rebellion spiraled into a full-blown call to arms. For 1968, Britain, a country already tense with protests, generational clashes, and political unrest, the timing couldn't have been more explosive. Censors wrung their hands, critics argued endlessly, and schools flat out banned the film from being shown to students. Some called it irresponsible, even dangerous, claiming it might inspire real-life violence. Others hailed it as a masterpiece, a bold metaphor for a society eating itself alive. What made If so unsettling wasn't just the violence, it was how close to reality it felt. The rigid hierarchies, the cruelty. Disguised as tradition, the way rebellion was portrayed not as madness, but as inevitable. For young viewers, it was a revelation. For the establishment, it was a nightmare. Half a century later, it still feels raw, still feels rebellious. Few films have captured the spirit of defiance as directly as If. And maybe that's why it still unnerves the powers that be. Sammy and Rosie Get Laid, 1987. Stephen Frears was never shy about poking the establishment, but Sammy and Rosie Get Laid sent critics into a frenzy. Set in a multicultural London suburb during Thatcher's era, the film followed a young, free-spirited couple navigating their marriage, friendships, and politics against a backdrop of unrest and inequality. What caused the outrage? It wasn't just the frankness of its characters, it was the unflinching critique of Britain itself. Racism, policing, social class, and broken political promises were woven into a messy, vibrant story that dared to say the quiet parts out loud. The Britain on screen wasn't polite or pretty. It was divided, angry, and restless. Politicians were furious. The press labeled it indecent, irresponsible, and provocative. Some argued it painted the country in the worst possible light, while others praised it for daring to show a side of London most films ignored. Audiences, meanwhile, were split down the middle. For some, it was liberating and necessary. For others, it was too much. Over time, the film has gained respect as one of the sharpest dissections of 1980s Britain. It captured the pulse of a nation in turmoil, showing that controversy isn't always about what's on screen. It's about the truths people don't want to face. The cook, the thief, his wife, and her lover, 1989. If you've ever wondered what pure outrage looks like on film, Peter Greenaway's The Cook, the Thief, his wife, and her lover serves it up on a silver platter. Lavish, grotesque, and unrelenting, it told the story of a brutal gangster, his suffering wife, her lover, and a cycle of revenge that spirals into the unthinkable. From its first screening, people walked out in droves. Some couldn't stomach its graphic imagery. Others found its relentless cruelty unbearable. Critics either hailed it as visionary or slammed it as tasteless. There was no middle ground. Britain's censors hacked away at it. International markets debated whether to show it, and yet, the film kept clawing its way into conversations. What made it so unforgettable wasn't just the violence, it was the style. Greenaway painted every frame like a Renaissance masterpiece, with costumes by Jean-Paul Gaultier and music by Michael Nyman. It looked gorgeous, even as it horrified. That clash, beauty and brutality colliding, left viewers reeling. For some, it was too much, a grotesque indulgence. For others, it was genius, a savage critique of greed, corruption, and power. Love it or hate it. The cook, the thief, his wife, and her lover proved one thing: cinema can disgust you and mesmerize you at the same time. My Beautiful Laundrette, 1985. Stephen Frears makes the list again, this time with My Beautiful Laundrette, a film that arrived like a thunderclap in Thatcher's Britain. Written by Hanif Qureshi, it told the story of Omar, a young British Pakistani man trying to transform a rundown laundrette into a thriving business. Along the way, he reconnects with an old friend, Johnny, played by Daniel Day-Lewis, whose ties to a local gang complicate everything. What made it controversial wasn't just the film's bold depiction of multicultural Britain, but how unapologetically it clashed with the political climate of the mid-1880s. Britain was deeply divided along lines of race, class, and identity, and here was a film holding that divide under a microscope. It showed immigrant families struggling with expectations, white working-class youth drifting into extremism, and love blooming in the least likely of places. Critics either hailed it as groundbreaking or tore it apart as irresponsible. For some, it was too direct, too fearless in tackling issues of racism, inequality, and generational conflict. For others, it was exactly what cinema should be, a reflection of the real world, messy and complicated. The film's legacy? It launched Daniel Day-Lewis toward stardom, made Qureshi a celebrated writer, and proved that British cinema didn't need castles or kings to matter. Sometimes all it needed was a laundrette and the courage to tell the truth. Caligula, 1979. Strictly speaking, Caligula was an Italian production. But when it arrived in the UK, it created such an uproar it became part of Britain's censorship history. Touted as a lavish historical epic about the infamous Roman emperor, what audiences got instead was chaos, a film caught between high art, political intrigue, and raw indulgence. The controversy came not only from what was shown on screen, but also from the way it was marketed. British audiences, expecting a grand historical drama, were instead hit with a spectacle that gleefully trampled boundaries. The British Board of Film Classification hacked away at it, leaving cinemas screening heavily cut versions. Newspapers thundered against it, politicians demanded accountability, and critics seemed to compete over who could condemn it more creatively. What made it stick wasn't just its content, but the fact it was released as a mainstream film. It was sold with the sheen of respectability, yet the moment people saw it, outrage followed. Debates about freedom of expression, censorship, and public morality raged, and for many, Caligula became the poster child of gone too far. Even today, its UK release remains a case study in what happens when art, commerce, and scandal collide. Did it deserve the fury, or was it just too much honesty in a country that liked to pretend otherwise? Either way, the storm it caused has never fully cleared. Lady Chatterley's Lover, 1981. Long before the film, D.H. Lawrence's novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover, had already been tried in court in Britain, with its publisher, Penguin Books, famously winning a landmark obscenity case in 1960. So, when director Just Jekin adapted it for the screen in 1981, expectations were sky high, and so was the outrage. The film stayed close to the novel's infamous plot, the forbidden affair between an upper-class woman and her working-class gamekeeper. But what sent critics into overdrive was the film's willingness to depict intimacy and social taboos on screen with a boldness rarely seen in early 1980s Britain. Reviewers dismissed it as crass, audiences flocked out of curiosity, and censors chopped away at certain scenes. Once again, the same debate that had gripped Britain 2 decades earlier reignited. Was this art faithfully translating Lawrence's critique of class and repression, or was it exploitation wearing a respectable mask? Regardless of where people stood, the film reignited national conversations about morality, censorship, and class barriers. It reminded audiences that the battles over what Britain could or could not watch were still alive and raging. And while the film itself is often criticized as clumsy, its cultural impact was undeniable. Kneel by Mouth, 1997. When Gary Oldman made his directorial debut with Kneel by Mouth, he didn't deliver a safe calling card. He delivered a cinematic gut punch. Set in South London, the film plunged into the cycles of poverty, addiction, and domestic abuse with a ferocity few films had dared to attempt. Ray Winstone gave a towering performance as a violent, self-destructive husband, while Kathy Burke brought devastating humanity to the role of his wife, struggling to survive the chaos. Oldman, drawing heavily from his own upbringing, didn't shy away from the harshest realities of working-class London. Every scene felt lived in, raw, and painfully authentic. What made it controversial was its unrelenting honesty. Critics lauded it as a masterpiece, but audiences were shaken. The violence was shocking, the language relentless. So relentless, in fact, that it set a record for profanity in a British film. It wasn't the kind of movie you left the cinema chatting lightly about. It was the kind you carried with you, heavy in your gut. Some called it too bleak, others praised it as essential. Either way, it forced Britain to confront a side of itself rarely shown on screen. Kneel by Mouth wasn't entertainment, it was survival put on film. The War Game, 1965. Peter Watkins's The War Game wasn't released to shock, it was made to warn. Commissioned by the BBC, it was a dramatized documentary imagining what would happen if Britain faced a nuclear attack. What Watkins created was so harrowing, so realistic, that the BBC refused to air it, claiming it was too disturbing for the public. The film depicted the lead-up to an attack, the devastation of nuclear blasts, and the grim aftermath, starvation, disease, and social collapse. It was shot in a stark documentary style that made it look chillingly real. Viewers who caught early screenings described it as unbearable. Critics who saw it praised its courage, but the government reportedly pressured the BBC to shelve it, fearing panic and political backlash. Instead of airing on television, it toured art houses and film festivals, eventually winning the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. Still, the BBC didn't air it until 1985, 20 years after it was made. By then, the Cold War was nearing its end, but its impact had only grown stronger. The War Game remains one of the most controversial films in British history because it wasn't fantasy, it was a plausible nightmare. And the fact that it was banned for 2 decades only proved how powerful it really was. So, what do these films tell us? That British cinema isn't just about costume dramas and cozy mysteries. It's about pushing buttons, breaking rules, and sparking debates that refuse to die. From Kubrick's banned masterpiece to Oldman's brutal debut, these films rattled cages and left scars on the culture. Which one shocked you the most? And which do you think still has the power to cause outrage today? Drop your thoughts below and let's argue it out.